I'm Bianca Bova from Bianca Bova Gallery here with painter Sarah Leuchtner. We are thrilled to be participating in the 2020 NADA Chicago Gallery Open. Sarah is going to talk a little bit about her practice today, and we're going to take a look at some of the works that are going to be in the booth. Sarah?
Hi, my name is Sarah Leuchtner. I'm a painter based in Chicago. I have a couple of my works here today to talk about. I'm kind of conceptually dealing with symbolism, pop culture, guilty pleasure, the history of the emoji, and then formally I'm dealing with kind of painterly marks, mark making, and experimenting with different paints and mediums and dyes.
Great. I want to start out talking about something that is a signature aspect of your practice, which is these proprietary dye mixes and these pigments that you bring in, which then lend senses of opacity or translucency, which cause marks to reemerge in the work, so that you're working almost in dialogue with former gestures, whether you meant to record them or not. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So through experimentation, I've been adding dyes into some of my paints. Most of my paintings have 10 to 15 layers, I'd say, but I try to keep the surface, the finished top layer, looking very flat. So throughout a work, I'm kind of layering, building up kind of this opacity and transparency, and in mixing these dyes into some of my paints, as you can see, this purple-pink form and layer has the dye in it. On this top layer of the painting with these white kind of repeated forms, the dye is being reactivated and is soaking back through. So it's becoming the kind of the top layer becoming present again, which I love, that kind of spatial play with materials. I've been investigating that.
So something else that we see in your work often is this visual language, or this kind of geometric vocabulary that you've developed. And we see this not just in terms of form or shape use, but we see it repetitively, we see it in different series and different scales. Can you talk about where that comes from and what the relationship it has to your practice looks like?
Sure. So I think a lot of the symbols I've kind of developed and used is this vocabulary of shapes that I've built. And some of them I pull from, within other works I've made come up with the forms on my own. A lot of them come from kind of emoji forms or forms in signage and graphic design, kind of these very readily available pop culture images, but then kind of conceptually dealing with what those mean, adding them into the work, but then also kind of just taking the forms, seeing them compositionally. One kind of process that helped me kind of go through all these shapes, I like to make kind of cataloging and sorting projects for myself. I got all of these stickers that were kind of the misruns or were promotional materials. They had like sample text or sample logo, and I categorized them all into different sections in terms of how I saw them visually, and then I cherry-picked a couple, and then I went back through, flipped them all over so I couldn't see the kind of graphic design or the logo on the front, and just looked at them kind of compositionally. So I think a lot of those kind of have played in throughout my recent works, and kind of seeing how those forms repeat.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. The range in which you draw from always impresses me. And I want to talk a little bit more about this work also in terms of scale. This is a work that I first saw the very first studio visit that I ever did with you, and it's always stuck with me because I've told you before, one of the things I love is when you work really small, you do these 12 by 12 inch square canvases, and then when you work really large, I think you have a tremendous command of economy of space and understanding what that means in terms of scaling a painting. And here we definitely see it on the larger side. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, because it seems like you bring in this classical element of kind of the head, the body, and you talk about scaling things to yourself often. Where that comes in terms of craft, where that comes in terms of conceptual side of your work.
Sure. I say it would play into both of those. I definitely kind of I try to respond the same way to when I'm making a smaller work to when I'm making, a 12 by 12 painting to making a 7-foot wide painting. I use kind of the same materials. I use the same brush sizes. So I love painting a tiny 12 by 12 painting with a giant brush and kind of letting that use of form be kind of transitioning throughout the scale of my works, but also being a painter and having scale relate to my body, my physical relationship to the works.
With that in mind, I want to take a look at the other piece we have on the wall here. This is Ghost, a Line. This is another work from 2018, and I wanted to start by talking a little bit about this recurring grid form that you use, because we sometimes see it, as with this work, showing up as sort of an underpinning to the graphic qualities, but we also sometimes see it in a much more literal manifestation graphically. And I'm interested in what influences you, if that's just a tool or if that's something that has a greater meaning to you.
Yeah, I use the grid aesthetically. I love how the grid looks, and throughout my work, I like having it kind of as a very graphic structural element that kind of contrasts and interacts with these very soft kind of shapes, forms, painterly marks. I think definitely growing up in Chicago, having that urban landscape grid has made me, more so inclined. Exactly. But having it here, it also creates kind of, I love how the grid creates the spatial play. It can create kind of distance within the painting, but it also reads as very flat with how the kind of mixed media and how I applied it. It's charcoal here. How it reads is very flat as well. This white form is a good example in my work of this kind of like addition subtraction method of mark making. I taped that off. That was one of the first layers after I adjusted the canvas, as well as kind of carving out some sections. I have kind of this reductive mark making technique as well. Here is a found object that I used. It's part of my play with contemporary kind of emoji form, these kind of symbols. I love that there's this relationship that we have with symbols, emojis, kind of how they're telling us what emotion to feel, and they're kind of, especially with young people, kind of having that language of communicating through symbols is very interesting to me. I like bringing that in, also in contrast with my kind of painterly approach too.
And with that idea of bringing in kind of the visual language of our generation, I want to talk a little bit more about the way that pop culture influences your work, because we do see these very direct manifestations of the forms of popular culture in your work. But I know that it also has a role in your studio practice and your studio time. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. While I'm making work in my studio, I'm always kind of experiencing guilty pleasure media, as I like to call it. A lot of reality television, specifically kind of the documentary style, low budget reality television, and just kind of taking in kind of different aspects of Western culture. There is this kind of interesting way that now with reality television, somebody can have no talent or whatsoever, be famous almost instantaneously, and then kind of seeing how you can follow that character through social media, how they live on past when the show ends, seeing what they do with their fame, how they're relating to the world. But yeah, a lot of guilty pleasure media is taken in while I'm making work, and just kind of that whole culture category.
And thinking about that, and thinking about, again, the way it manifests itself when you're using this idea of the emoji as a way of decoding things, or a directly communicative aspect of your work, it's interesting to me because, as we know, as our generation tends to use those forms, it has an almost hieroglyphic appeal, where you understand these symbols in a particular order, what they're supposed to signify, how to interpret them, what the emotional response to that is. And I feel that way often when I look at your work, that there is a sense of almost recall or recognition without recall. I know what this is, I know what it's supposed to make me feel, but I don't quite know why I know that. And it seems like you really tap into that, while at the same time, you often call back to these almost iconographic, borderline classically religious geometric forms. And we also see this repetitious use of the ghost, entitling an image, but it's often this kind of emoji-like or almost cartoonish ghost figure. So I'm interested in that popular culture and spirituality and where those intersect in your practice.
Yeah, another kind of theme I've worked with is seeing what spirituality means to young people now, and kind of being an outsider looking into this whole kind of astrology movement, how young people are finding spirituality and astrology. I do have kind of this vague ghost form throughout a lot of my pieces, and I want to kind of insert these kind of visual triggers for people where they kind of recognize this form, but they don't know why, they don't know where they've seen it, you know, why they're reacting to it. And I think that that's now what, with our new kind of visual language through emoji, a lot of people kind of can instantly recognize something or get a message from a symbol. And I love kind of exploring that, seeing how I'm taking that in as a painter and then putting it into my work, kind of another step in that kind of visual language process.
Which is something that I really love about your practice, because I think a lot of artists, a lot of young artists who are engaged in, you know, their moment in time, this cultural moment, are often expressing it in a very literal or figurative way. And it seems like you really have approached it through abstraction and through sort of the baseline shared common visual language. So rather than addressing something head on as political or social, it's this deeper embedded orientation in your work.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of what I think makes it so great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you to everyone who joined us, and again, thank you to Nada for having us in the Chicago Gallery Open and for being in Chicago again this year. I'm Bianca Bova from Bianca Bova Gallery. This is Sarah Leuchtner. Thanks so much. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.